Thank you. It is a pleasure to be here. It's very nice to get to Iowa during the caucus season. The last time I was here at this time of year was in 2000. I came to give a presentation to your campaign finance regulatory organization in Des Moines. It was about 10 degrees. There was a foot of snow on the ground, and I was as sick as I think I've ever been in my life. But it's a pleasure to be here. It's such a beautiful day. We heard from Paul about a lot of controversy in this process, a lot of change that's happened in recent years, and it's absolutely true. We're dealing with some pretty fundamental principles of American politics, I think, when we talk about regulating the funding of campaigns and the way we conduct our politics. It is, as the Supreme Court often reminds us, a fundamental principle that no one can stop me, no one can restrict my ability to speak freely, particularly about public issues and issues of importance and political consideration. Most especially, nobody can stop me from complaining about the government. We see all over the world that there are examples of incentives that governments have to try to restrict that kind of behavior and to deal with free speech in that way. And it's just kind of an anathema to us that can happen. At the same time, there's another pretty basic principle that most of us hold, and that is that everybody's vote is equal to everybody else's, and everybody is entitled to the same kind of representation in this democracy that everyone else has. And so how these principles deal with each other, how they balance, how we move from one direction to the other, is the way this process gets changed. There's one aspect of it, though, that really doesn't have a whole lot of controversy in it, and that's the idea that everybody should have the information they need to make judgments on their own about how this process works and whether or not it's problematic that we have all this money from such few sources, and how we can interpret that information and make our own judgments about our political behavior is pretty fundamental. That has gotten consensus even among the Supreme Court. We have all these 5-4 decisions on these important matters, but all of them include aspects where the justices actually voted, for example, 8-1 in Citizens United. That the one thing that was valid and critically important, they said, was that this information be disclosed, that people be able to understand who's doing this and in what way. So there's broad agreement across the normally controversial boundaries here that disclosure is important, that the information is key. We certainly believe that. I've been doing it for a very long time, and the center has benefited from that and does it extraordinarily well. So I should be finished, right? There's nothing else to say. Disclosure is good. Everybody agrees. I can stop, but maybe not so much. I'm going to talk about a couple of things because this is an august and academic body. I'm going to talk about some conceptual ideas first. There's a difference to me between disclosure and transparency. Disclosure is a necessary condition. It's a process that we go through in order to make the information available. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we've achieved the kind of transparency that we're looking for. Transparency is a little broader. It's that we get the meaningful information, the information that allows us to really make good judgments about what's happening. And so we're going to see some examples of disclosure and some examples of transparency and some of the challenges that we're facing in this regard. This is disclosure. This is a page from Senator Ernst's most recent campaign finance report filed with the Federal Election Commission. I'm not picking on Joni Ernst. She's an example of what happens in this context. All the members of the Senate, everybody who's involved in Senate campaigns, submits their information in actually this way, which is to say thousands and thousands of pieces of paper with information about the donations that they receive and the expenditures that they make, paper that then has to be translated into data and information that we can sift and understand and synthesize and get real transparency from. But that has to be done manually in this process. They're the only ones left who do it that way because the Senate's just a special place. At some point we'll get there. I said when I left the FEC that I could see the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I can see it, and it has to do with these people taking the data that they have as data in their campaigns and just providing it. I'm going to talk about a couple of pieces of information. When you look at a disclosure form like this, it looks like every piece of information is roughly equal to every other. There's a name of a donor, there's an address, there's a date, an amount of the contribution, an aggregate amount from that person, because there are limits. We have to keep track of that. There's information about the employer and the occupation for that person. and what campaign it was designated for. It all kind of feels equal. There's no balance one way or the other. But in fact, it's not equal. In the context of employer versus occupation, for example, it's not enough for me to know that somebody is a medical director. You could be a medical director of anything. That's your occupation. Perhaps it's more important that that this person is the medical director at Pfizer Pharmaceuticals. That tells me something more about what's happening. Our ability to make the information transparent is contingent on our understanding of where the sources of funds are. And so we look at sectors of the economy and how those sectors behave in terms of their political behavior and their activity. You can see lots from just this little chart. There's the totals for each of the prominent sectors. There's their breakdown if they're giving directly to candidates between Democrats and Republicans. There's also the extent to which they're focused on these outside groups that Paul talked about before. Some industries much more than others. So we're learning a lot more about the context of this information. It's much more transparent when we look at it. Here's an example down to the level of a specific member of Congress, Paul Ryan in 2014. Now the speaker, he was a committee chairman. And we can see the ranking of sectors for him and compare that to the ranking of sectors for all the donors in his district who've given to any kind of political organization. So, retired people, because retired people are kind of count themselves as one. We've got disposable income that other people don't necessarily have. We may be more engaged in politics than others, and so we're more active. It was first for him in his support for his directly for his campaign committee. It's second in his district rank. But that's not consistently true through there. He's a committee chairman. And so obviously other kinds of interests focus on people like that. And they make those contributions more directly to those members than perhaps to others. Let's compare that with your own member of Congress. Here there's a different dynamic, but it's transparent. I can see it. He obviously had a competitive race. Every House race in Iowa was competitive in 2014. That's just extraordinary. So there were lots of focuses from party leaders, from members of Congress themselves, from other candidate committees that gave to him that don't necessarily do that, and certainly aren't relevant in the district itself. There's also a lot of labor money in here because he's the one Democratic representative from the state that you wouldn't see perhaps in his district, but that's very important nationally. So he gets that. Individuals are becoming more important in the process because the limits on individuals are indexed for inflation, and so therefore they grow each election cycle. It's not true for PACs. Those limits are the same as they were in 1974 when they were first created. So there's a natural evolution towards more focus on individual people. Beyond that, with this McCutcheon decision, which was the most recent Supreme Court decision that changed the rules a little bit, there's now no overall limit on how much I as a person can give to lots and lots of different members of Congress or candidates for office. That used to be limited to a little more than $100,000 altogether. That's no longer true. And so again, more focus on individual people, but not very many individual people. As you can see from this distribution, a very small percentage of people give money in meaningful amounts at all. And when we're talking about meaningful amounts now, we're talking about $2,600, which in 2014 was the limit for how much you could give to a single candidate in a single election. At the bottom, you can see that about 1,300 people give a huge percentage. 15% of all the money that came in contributions that were more than $2,600, all of them from throughout the country, were given by about 1,300 people, which is less than 1% of the number of people who made those contributions. So we're compacting the system. We're squeezing everything into a relatively small number of people. As I said, while there's general consensus, and certainly on the court's disclosure is not a problem, the specifics of disclosure are still contentious. In the state legislature in Wisconsin, one of your neighboring states, just in the last few weeks, the legislature passed a bill that eliminates the requirement to disclose the employer of every donation. Members of the Senate who actually stopped and considered this piece of legislation, this element of it, for a couple of days before they passed it. Said that, well, we still have occupation, and so we don't really need the employer. There might be threats to employers. There might be boycotts that wouldn't be necessary just because somebody gave a contribution to a candidate that wasn't popular. This is the problem we need to stop. Remember the role of transparency in the process. Remember how important employer information is in This is not a trivial change. It's a threat to the real substance of transparency. And if it happens in a place like Wisconsin, it can happen in lots of places. So there are challenges to disclosure. In addition to transparency. There's a lot of words in this page, and so there's really no way to assimilate it, except to say that the shaded, the bottom is a time period, how close we are to an election. And the shaded area is a period during which, by law, ads that Paul talked about before that mention a candidate but don't say you should vote for this person or you should defeat this person, are not considered to be electoral at all. And so there's actually no requirement to disclose that activity to anybody, even the spending of that activity. So we have this big period of time now where we don't know how much money is being spent, but we can find out that specific groups ran 16,000 ads, for example, in this context, or 33,000 ads in the case of Americans for Prosperity, during this period when there was no disclosure at all. And then they shifted from these kinds of generic messages, but showing candidates but not telling you you should vote for them. Once these windows opened when you would have to disclose that spending, they shifted to directly advocating for or against it. They were very clear in their intention. These were the independent expenditures. So we've created boundaries. The boundaries may not mean very much, and we're losing just disclosure, simple disclosure in some contexts. This is another example of that process. And there's another part of the disclosure of this information that's important. And it depends on what kind of organization you are. And it's really almost impenetrable to figure out, to talk about coherently to people who aren't oriented toward the legalistic language that we use. Crossroads GPS at the top in blue is a 501c4 organization. It's a social welfare that does these activities. They're trying to educate people about issues, they would say. They're also trying to educate people about particular people who support those issues or who are important in the context of what their message might be. They happen to be running for office. They spend money directly, $26 million towards the bottom on the left, directly advocating for and against candidates. They ran 16,000 ads before the time when they had to report that at all. We can keep track of that from other sources. We know how many they had. We don't know how much they spent. We don't know how many there were. They also give money to other organizations. They gave $4.8 million to a group called Carolina Rising. Carolina Rising happened to spend 4.7 of those $4.8 million in ads advocating the election of Senator Tillis in North Carolina. That was the most contentious Senate race in 2014. He defeated the incumbent in that race. They gave money in large amounts to the Chamber of Commerce, who also spend actively in campaigns, to the American Future Fund, to the Kentucky Opportunity Coalition, which supported Mitch McConnell's re-election. The point is, they're spending huge amounts of money, both directly and indirectly, by making grants to other groups. But only part of that money counts in the context of whether or not they should have to disclose their donors, most particularly. And so because they're getting it indirectly, giving it through other organizations, they don't disclose the donors. They're defeating the principle that 8 members of the Supreme Court suggested was so important. And this dynamic leads to this. This is, to the extent that we're able to know, the structure of Freedom Partners and its affiliated organizations. This happens to be, I'm almost sorry that this is true, but it happens to be the organization that was created by the Koch brothers to express their fairly strongly held and pretty strongly ideological views throughout the country. There are n numbers of organizations. There are hundreds of millions of dollars in this process that they do this for a reason. They're not making this up just to see how complicated they can make it. They're making it up to see how difficult it can be to keep track of who's doing what, to have real transparency in the process, to have meaningful disclosure of the system. And to the extent that we have systems like this, we fall short in our ability to actually understand. And that's the challenge, I think, that represents our efforts in terms of disclosure going forward as we fight these other, as we consider, we're not going to nip at each other's nose today. We're going to talk about the challenges that we face in terms of trying to regulate the system. But it begins, to me, with being able to know what happened. And that's thank you.
Well, I agree that David Mann